Once, there's a story, Teresa of Avila was riding on her horse through the Castilian countryside, and it was raining. It was raining very, very hard. The old mare had a bit of a reputation for stubbornness and decided she had had enough, bucked, and off came Teresa, who was given to her own share of cantankerry, and she landed in an undignified fashion, splash on her behind in a big puddle. She looked up to heaven and shook her fist and said through gritted teeth, "Well, if this is how you treat your friends, no wonder you have so few." Under the comic surface, I don't suppose it was comic to her, but Teresa makes a serious point. God does not seem to make things easy for those who believe in him. And Teresa's mishap is comparatively small fry if we think of the plagues, natural disasters, the betrayals, the persecutions which down the age have routinely been suffered by Christians. And of course not just by Christians. It can be very difficult to believe in God at all, whether that means believing in his existence or trusting his goodness, when we are confronted not just with suffering, but with positive evil and injustice in the world. People nowadays often speak of a trilemma in this regard. They say, how can God be all good and all powerful and yet not make the world a better place? And if he's really done the best job he could do, if this is supposed to be the best of all possible worlds, well, goodness knows what the others must be like. The end point of this kind of reasoning, though we often hear it from those quarters, is not, I think, the clever clogs atheism of people like Richard Dawkins. When we are confronted with really acute suffering, whether it's our own or the suffering of a loved one or the empathy we feel when we look at the images on the newsreel, the question of God's existence can become actually quite academic and distant. Frankly, what should we care? If God enters into the picture at all, it's either in the hope of someone who is going to comfort and reassure us, or more likely, more realistically, as an object of bewilderment or even of resentment. The whole attitude, I think, is summed up by a character of Dostoevsky in his novel The Brothers Karamazov. Ivan Karamazov, to all appearances, is a suave progressivist. He's a secularist and a liberal, someone who doesn't seem to give a fig about religion. But actually, in conversation with his brother Alyosha, we find that things go much deeper. Dostoevsky puts on his lips a declaration that is much more haunting than the atheist's plain, "I don't believe." You know, Ivan says, there may be a God, and maybe even the philosophers can prove that he exists. Maybe he made me and gave me life. Let's say it's all true. But you know what? If that's so, well, I'd give back my ticket. I don't want anything to do with this God. I wash my hands of him. I cannot have truck with a God who allows innocent children to suffer. And this, I think, is the problem presented to us in this station. Jesus falls now for a second time. Faith, we thought, should give us stability, assurance, answers. Faith, we were told, is supposed to be a place on which we can stand, from which to make sense of the world, standing and understanding. But how can we say, I believe in God, when he seems so absent? How can we trust a father who does this to the one that is called his son? Or how can we say, I believe in Jesus Christ, if that means I take my stand on one who stumbles and falls? In the Bible, earlier on, this same complaint is anticipated by the figure of Job in the Old Testament. Job is decent, upright, prosperous, just in his dealings with his fellow men and reverent towards God. And yet one day on a whim, Satan thinks he would like to pick on Job, and God, pretty much on a whim as well it seems, gives him permission. So Job's children are struck dead, his livestock are destroyed, and he himself is smitten down with horrendous sores. And Job, at the end of all this, turns to God and cries, "How could you do this? Why?" And not just that, but he sees the injustice done to himself everywhere around him in the world. From out of the city the dying groan, he complains, and the soul of the wounded cry for help. Yet God pays no attention to their prayer. Job calls God to account, and he demands a fair hearing from this so-called Lord of the world. The difficulty of belief and the perplexity of God's ways, we shouldn't try to conceal or hide away. If we do, we deceive ourselves and we play false to what God clearly admits. Job is given to us in sacred scripture for a reason. In fact, we could say that the whole of the Old Testament is as much an attempt to make sense of God's apparent absence as of his often uncanny and terrifying presence. When in the book of Judges, the angel of the Lord appears to Gideon, the angel addresses him, "Gideon, the Lord is with you." And Gideon turns around and says, "Well, excuse me, sir, but if the Lord is with me, then why do my people and I labor under bondage and oppression?" And when at length the angel departs, Gideon is struck with fear because he realizes the identity of his visitor. And no man can see God and live. Gideon is struck with fear for his life. So there's an apparent tension, a paradox. We cannot bear God to be absent, and yet we cannot be present face to face with him. In the New Testament, then, the letter to the Hebrews insists that faith has to be in things which are unseen. And St. John's Gospel talks about believing as a matter of overcoming the world. This whole collection of paradoxes, I think, is best captured by St. Paul, who in his first letter to the Corinthians delights in the thought that God chooses to reveal his strength in what to our eyes is weakness and death, and God chooses to reveal his wisdom in what looks like madness, the madness of a battered man strung up on a gibbet. Later Christians would take a hint from this idea of Paul's that there's a total inversion of human values going on in the crucifixion. The 2nd or 3rd century writer Tertullian, in fact, went so far as to say, "Credo quia absurdum," I believe just because it is so absurd. This sounds almost the opposite of Ivan Karamazov's attitude. It's like saying, "You know what, God? You have such pluck, you have such cheek, I'll take my hat off to you. This is all just so ridiculous, I'll go along with it." The only problem with that is that it seems there's already so much so absurd in the world. Why do we need to bring God into the equation? Why don't we just face the music and say that nothing really matters to me? If you can take some pleasure in an aesthetic of the absurd with Camus and Kafka, well, good for you. And if you want to construct for yourself some sort of moral identity or purpose in life, go ahead and try. If you would rather just drown yourself in empty pleasures and that floats your boat, well, who am I to say you nay? Nihilism, relativism, hedonism, these are all big and fancy words, but actually these attitudes very concretely characterize what we see all around us. People have given up on the moral point of Ivan Karamazov's desperate challenge just as much as they've given up on the idea of a god or corporate religion. We would much rather etherize ourselves like patients on a table. And if we dare, we Christians, if we dare to reduce the Christian story to just another fable of the absurd, albeit with the fairy tale ending of the resurrection, we make it just one more narrative equally incapable of offering us any real redemption. More fundamentally, the trouble with absolutizing the absurd is that the absurd only counts as absurd by contrast with a backdrop of normality. If everything is absurd, if everything is illogical, then nothing can really be absurd or illogical because there's no normality and no logic to elude in the first place. And that's why the absurd very often resolves itself into what we think of as comic or tragic. Little everyday absurdities usually give us reason to chuckle. I know an old man who likes to tell the story of two old men on the tube, both of them hard of hearing. And one says to the other, "Is it Wembley already?" The reply comes, "No, it's Thursday." And he then says back, "Oh, well, so am I, let's go and have a drink." In these cases, however mildly amusing, the absurdity just fizzles out. Nothing comes of it. Tragedy ensues when the absurd seems to take over and when our lives begin to unravel under its force. In ancient Greece, the story of Oedipus was considered to be the classic tragic story. The whole series of events by which a decent man can come to murder his father and bed his mother would be ridiculous were it not so ruinous. It's so ruinous, in fact, that Oedipus never escapes his fate. He never escapes or gets over the events that befall him until he dies. In the life of Christian belief, then, the problem of evil articulates an absurdity. It articulates an absurdity which we could laugh about, or which would be a point of academic observation, were it not for the fact that it afflicts us all quite so directly and sometimes so devastatingly. But if the Christian life is not to be simply another tragedy, the absurd cannot have the final say. As St. Paul says again to the Corinthians, if the resurrection has not happened, then your faith is in vain, and our preaching is in vain. We of all men are most to be pitied, because we put our hope where there was none to be had. So we can only say, I believe because it is so absurd, if there's something to couch the absurdity and make better sense of it. Some backdrop which allows us to say, yes, this was absurd, it was even horrific, but the horror does not have the last word. Credo quia absurdum means, I believe in the absurdity of the Christian message. I take my stand on one who stumbles and put my trust in the one who is crucified, because in that crucified one, in the inversion of our expectations, God has been honest about the mess of our lives, and at the same time, he has provided a way out. Of course, it's the resurrection that takes the final say, and it's the resurrection that allows us to make sense of the cross. But it's the way of the cross that allows us to make sense of the pain and the suffering and the apparent absence of God all around us, the way that the world has been ever since Adam and Eve left Eden. If there were only a resurrection, if there were only an appearing from the sky, a kind of deus ex machina, God may well have magicked our problems away, but he wouldn't have explained himself for all the rubbish that has gone before and carries on. Yet in Jesus, in the suffering servant, God has admitted the wrongness of things. He has at last given Job a fair hearing and something of an answer. Because God himself has suffered with us, and even Jesus, the Son of God, can cry, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Job, then, is not alone, and we are not alone. God has joined us in our dereliction to lift us up out of it. On such a God, I am willing to take my stand.